the John McCain's and the Cheneys and
all the neocons.
The dreams of the neocons of focusing on Iran have finally come to pass.
Yes, so I'm glad you're talking about this. I'm actually very worried, and I just tweeted this little clip, a short clip from part of the 60 Minutes interview with the Vice President Kamala Harris, the candidate, that was actually not aired as part of the big interview, but the clip was posted later, where she's asked about the country's, America's greatest adversary, and she goes on and says Iran, and then follows by saying that they have American blood on their hands. And I saw a few colleagues tweeting. I also tweeted basically that this is how endless war started. This is how every endless war started, with rhetoric. Iraq, Afghanistan, go back as far as you want. And it's just, also confusing, maybe contradictory, that this is an administration that is supposedly against endless wars. It's an administration that ended one endless war, completed, however messy that war in Afghanistan, to then oversee in the same term, not even the next term, to then oversee or help or pave the way or get pulled in, however you want to frame it, into another big war with Iran, which is going to be much bigger, more devastating than the war in Iraq. So I don't know if they even realize it. I don't think anybody in Washington is really going out there publicly promoting and wanting a big war, the next big war with Iran. But you can also stumble onto a war. You can sleepwalk into it. And yes. I think that's kind of the situation that we're seeing. And when I do interviews, they ask me about the next, is this turning into the big Middle East war? Is this war expanding? Is it escalating? We're already there. This is the big Middle East war in front of us. It has only been expanding in the past year, and it has only escalated into multiple fronts. And it's just going more and more. And, the only way to stop it, I would say, is to prioritize a very serious diplomacy. Now, this takes different shapes and forms on different fronts, but it's just something that I haven't seen the administration do. They just talk about it. They promised it on the campaign trail to prioritize diplomacy, be an administration on human rights, and all of that. I haven't really seen much action the past year.
I mean, I have the very smallest sliver of hope that a lot of this is bullshit to get elected by people who she who don't love her. Like she's not trying to get our vote. She's not trying to get youth votes, because this is the biggest issue. Palestine, Gaza, everything that's come of it is the biggest issue. But Kamala Harris has it in her. She negotiated the biggest prisoner swap since the Cold War, with many different countries getting Americans out of Russia and vice versa, right? They can do this. This is not, which is good. I applaud that move. So you can absolutely do the same thing here. But again, like you said, I think they are definitely sleepwalking into another war. It's been a little bit of time now. It's been over a week since, Iran fired, I think, almost 200 missiles at Israel. They were largely shot down by not Israel, but the United States. Again, none of which would have happened if all of this escalatory stuff hadn't happened. The killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader in Tehran, the bombing back in April of the embassy in Damascus, the Iranian embassy in Damascus. It's just been on and on and on and on. And to say nothing of the fact that the people are targeted are all people who talked about ceasefire. Haniyeh was on the precipice of agreeing to a ceasefire.
He was a negotiator. He was a negotiator then. Yes.
Kill him. He's got to go. Yeah. He's got to go. So they're doing everything in their power to move away from that diplomacy. But I guess the question isn't, as you just said, the war is already here, but it's sort of like Israel's move. What are you hearing from the ground in Iran? And what is I imagine the appetite for something like this from the Iranian people is next to nothing, but what do you know?
Well, certainly not the Iranian people. I would argue most people in the region, especially those who are on the crossroads of the war, if you talk to them, don't want the war to expand to their own neighborhood, and definitely not Iranians. I would also say we here in the US, the American society also has no appetite for another war. If they understand what's happening to them, that's the other thing,
Right.
how you frame and message and present a war that you're stumbling into, as we continue to hear this term about limited strikes and just going in temporarily and things like that. But I think in Iran, it depends on which faction we look at, because it's obviously not a monolith, just like here it isn't, even in Israel, Lebanon, across the region. But in Iran, what happened is there's been a change of administration. So the previous president, who was a hardliner conservative, died in a helicopter crash. And now our new president, a reformist, was just elected and took power. And by the way, Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran as he was there attending the inauguration of the president on his first day in office of a reformist president. So this president has tried, it seems, that the mandate, and what we've also seen as far as past reformists, is trying to prioritize diplomacy, or at least push more for it. So if we look at them as sort of the moderates in the Iranian political structure, he has the same negotiating team back who negotiated the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, with the Americans. Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister, his deputy, who's now the foreign minister, everyone kind of moved up. So there's the president, foreign minister is now vice president, his deputy is now foreign minister, and almost the entire negotiating team with the US, who had delivered something successful as far as diplomacy with the United States in the past. And now that's a signal, I think, from the entirety of the state, not just the reformists and not just the administration, but also from the top, the supreme leader, all the way, that they've sort of handed back the foreign policy file to the moderates, being like, you go fix it. Because however that hardline conservative president was doing things in the past 3 or so years, because he died before his 4-year term, that wasn't working for the country. So adversity with the animosity with the US brings a lot of economic sanctions. The Trump administration pulling out of the JCPOA, reimposing economic sanctions on the country. And it's just something that has put a lot of pressure on everyday Iranians. So the moderates are at least in charge of, the official foreign ministry, not the entirety of the political structure. The president is not the number one person in power in Iran. There's the supreme leader and the president, and the others are sort of in tier 2. But he is a very important person. And he was in New York at the UN trying to bring that message of diplomacy. He even called himself, an envoy for peace, and saying we don't want the war. But nevertheless, they are engaged in this war. There are hardline forces, there are militant forces within the Iranian political structure who, they're part of the allies, or sort of at top of this axis of resistance. And so they're engaged in the war. And so there's this push and pull, I would say, between the moderates and the forces who are trying to prioritize and push for more diplomacy, and also the ones who want more, engagement on the battlefield as far as hard power versus soft power. So we've seen a combination of that. So, for example, after the Haniyeh assassination in Tehran, the Iranians didn't retaliate immediately. They were waiting. So I would say the moderates had the upper hand for a while, but then they came the assassination of the Hezbollah leader together with an Iranian commander. And so for both of those, the Iranians retaliated with this missile barrage on Israel last week. And now we're waiting for retaliation from Israel back to Iran. And, these are all mini escalations that each side is trying to frame as establishing deterrence. But when you're establishing deterrence, it's not guaranteed
everyone's
that
claiming that.
That the other side doesn't come to you with their own deterrence. So that's why I would say this war has only been expanded in the past year in all of these multiple fronts, and the fire is just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the assassination attempts, or plots, not attempts, but alleged plots on Donald Trump's life that apparently Iran is also doing. I mean, they're working on a lot of fronts.
They are. So let me just clarify: the two assassination attempts, as far as I follow, were not linked, but Iran has sort of its own list, which also, again, is retaliation for when Donald Trump assassinated the top Iranian general, and then Iranians put out this list of the top people who were responsible for that assassination, and now the U.S. has to protect their lives with very expensive security for the rest of, I guess, for their entirety. And so all of these things, accumulate. You make these decisions, these security or foreign policy decisions in the region, and they have long-term ramifications. And, it's a tactic, which battle you win, but also a long-term war or a sort of a long-term strategy.
I have a question just regarding the players here when it comes to both Iran and Israel. It is hard for me as, a Western outside observer to not look at the actions, the trading of fire between these two countries, and not look at the Iranians as actually acting as the adults on the world stage, which is not something that obviously you would hear in media, but you see the way in which that barrage of missile attacks that happened recently, the way in which the casualty figures was very low. I think one is all I heard was reported. I'm sure a lot
of them were shot down, but yes,
right. But a lot of them also landed. But where they landed in terms of the targets that were chosen were very clearly military targets. And then you juxtapose that with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, and then and then Nasrallah and the Iranian commander,
leveling entire
neighborhoods. And so it's hard for me as someone who, was raised in America with the idea, especially, as someone was raised with Zionism and a little bit of neoconism in the home. It's hard for me to not just look at this as just a complete inversion of what the narrative is. And you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it does seem like Iran is a responsible actor on the world stage here. Am I missing something?
Well, I don't know about adults in the room, because the adults also come with power, and I would like to think that that's still the United States. I actually tweeted something along these lines saying, the U.S. can be, if they want to, the adult in the room who can break up the fight. They actually have the power and the leverage, both in hard power and in a form of soft power, which so far hasn't been used, the second one, to break up the fight. And they just aren't doing it. They just have their thumb on the scale on one side and pretending like they don't have the leverage to stop the fight. I would say, though, if we talk in foreign policy terms, Iran has showed a lot of restraint.
Yes.
In the past year. So as you were saying, the two attacks on Israel that came from Iran were both retaliations, although that's not how we see it framed in the media, which I think is a disservice also to the American public. If you, with every conflict or every moment of the conflict, you don't bring the context or the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks that led to what you're seeing. And have your audience only hear one part of the story or 50% of the situation, I think it's a disservice, because America is also very much involved in this war, at least financially, but also as far as arms supplies, diplomatically providing the coverage, and then potentially, U.S. forces may be pulled in if this turns into the next big Middle East war with Iran. But anyways, to your point, Iran has showed a lot of restraint. Both of these attacks on Israel, the way they framed it, were retaliation. One was for the attack on Iranian consulate in Syria, which they saw on an Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, which they saw as crossing a major red line. And then also the assassination of Haniyeh and the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, together with an Iranian commander. But they were both designed as warning shots. A warning shot is not supposed to have mass casualties, but it's supposed to serve as a warning. And what are the warnings? There are 2 points to these warnings from Iran, because obviously Iran is the underdog. Iran can't match the military might of Israel, a nuclear state with about, I don't know, whatever the number is of warheads, which Iran doesn't have any. And then also with the support of the world superpower, which is the United States. But so
Iran is 1 week away from having a nuke. I don't know if you know that.
Iran has been a nuclear state, if you sort of read the confused reporting and analysis.
I read this every week for the last 20 years. They have been 1 week away from a nuke.
For quite a while, yes. But they've been the underdog. But I think what they showed is that, one, they have the capacity to do an attack, and that's sort of a warning, and cause, if they meant it to not be a warning shot, but an actual attack, that they can cause a lot of damage. And 2, I would say the willingness, because before that, the understanding was that they're bluffing, they would never do it, they're not willing to. And so I think that's on both of these warning shots. I would say the sort of the battlefield or the commanders or these hardline forces in the country basically won the argument that we need to show how crazy we can be if push comes to shove and if this war starts, and that's basically the design of the warning shot. So showing the capacity of whatever they have, this arsenal of missiles and whatnot, and also the willingness to do if this becomes. And I think, and I would just add that the U.S., so the administration does take that seriously. I think in rhetoric and somewhat in policy, they're not interested in starting or being pulled into a war with Iran. But at the same time, they're sort of paving the way for it, or allowing their ally to pave the way for it and bring them to a point of no return.
Well, and especially when, the United States currently has troops in Iraq, and Iraqi groups have said, we will be, if this continues, we're going to start attacking Americans. And they've already been attacked, but so far there haven't been casualties, but it's like, what if they escalated? And that's something that, Trita Parsi's talked about on the show multiple times. But I want to talk, because here's my thing with Iran. From the first week of this genocide, because let's go back to Gaza. From the very first weeks, a perfect foil for a lot of my liberal Zionist friends was being able to sort of rise above talking about, 40,000 dead Palestinians, and talk about, but Iran, that in some ways the greater threat justifies the current genocide. And I obviously that's morally wrong, and also maybe factually wrong. Right. But I did want to talk about what we're being told now is the axis of resistance, right? It's Iran and their proxies, or if the groups that they help to fund, including Hamas, including Hezbollah, and the Houthis, the Triple H, right, that have been, attacking trade routes. Now, what's really interesting about all these groups is that they have said, Hezbollah just reaffirmed, the Houthis have said this, that they will stop when there is a ceasefire, when Israel has agreed to a ceasefire. And yet we are being told that kind of these are intractable, psychotic, almost ISIS-like, irrational groups that will stop at nothing to shed blood, when they've been very, very clear what their, lines are for ending any kind of violence, for stopping, missiles and whatnot. So I guess I just want to ask you about, if the occupation ends, let's imagine, isn't that a lot of the root of some of these so-called proxies and these organizations? We know Hezbollah was created thanks to the Israeli invasion in 1982 of Lebanon. Can you just explain sort of how this big knot gets loosened greatly when there is a change in policy, and when there's a change in the Israeli occupation and those forces?
Sure. So you're absolutely right, Francesca. These groups are resistance to something. Resistance to what? Resistance to, as you say, depending on each of their locations, to occupation, to what they see as foreign intervention. In the case of the Houthis, to what they see as tyranny or domestic regimes that are being supported or propped up by foreign forces, be it the United States or other Middle East powers. So each of them have their own, and that's why I actually don't like calling them proxies. I don't think that's a very accurate term, although that's what's become mainstream here in the media, because that gives you the sense that there are buttons in Tehran that they can push on and off and turn them on and off, and in fact actually created them. These groups have each had their own local organic grounding, like you said, Hezbollah, invasion of Lebanon by Israel, and the same goes with Hamas, the Houthis, also the Shia militias in Iraq that are supported by Iran. So they're all allies. It's a network of allies. And by the way, the axis The axis of resistance name came after George Bush called Iran, Syria, and others the axis of evil.
Yes.
And they went around saying, we're actually not evil. You are the evil, and we're an axis of resistance, resisting your evil. So that's where the term comes from. But nevertheless, resistance, muqawamat is what they call themselves. Muqawamat to something, resistance to something. And so, and each of them, by the way, have different, relationships, different distance, different format as far as being allies of Tehran. But it's a group of loose network of state and non-state actors that are basically, in their view, resisting this hegemony, U.S. hegemony, intervention, presence of U.S. forces, the wars that U.S. has raged in the region, and also U.S.'s closest allies, Israel, and also by extension Saudi Arabia, which is the main issue in the fight in Yemen. So, and to your question, yes, all of them basically came in their framing to the defense of the Palestinians when the attack started in Gaza, and all of them sort of tied their attacks or their escalations to that war and bombing in Gaza. And all of them have been saying all along that they are willing to de-escalate or basically be part of the ceasefire if that ceasefire happens in Gaza. And interestingly, also, the U.S. has been pushing sort of this diplomacy, trying to decouple it or detach it from the situation in Gaza. They've tried that in Lebanon all along, to sort of come to terms or to an agreement with Hezbollah, with the Lebanese, without sort of this looking at the situation in Gaza. And also the same goes with the Houthis. It hasn't worked. Like I said, the war has only expanded. If Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, taught us anything, is that hard power alone doesn't work. You go after what you think is a big monster. And as my colleague Matt Duss put it one time, you end up midwifing little monsters along the way, and you can't fight every single one of them, and then you have to essentially pull out in a kind of mess that we saw in Afghanistan. So there's no good that can come out of this sort of seeing everything as a nail and using your one hammer to try to hammer every single nail. It hasn't worked in that region for decades, and I don't think it's going to work this time. But I just want to reiterate, every time someone's trying to go at the problem with a hammer, they've promised everyone that this is just the one last nail that I'm going to take care of with a hammer. And don't worry, this is not going to be an endless war. This is not going to burn down the entire region. And this is going to be successful. Remember, George Bush and all, they promised they'll get it out of Iraq, very soon. I don't remember what the promise, but it wasn't 20 years. Afghanistan, the same thing. No one said we're going to go into these countries for the next 20 years, create a mess, and then leave it worse than it was 20 years later and come out. But that's how it starts. And then you.
I mean, and you see the same thing, like the trying to erase the Palestinians from the equation of diplomacy or bilateral relationships or whatever it is. They do it with the Abraham Accords. And now they're doing it on over issues that clearly stem from Israel's actions. And it's like, anything, we will tie ourselves into knots. We will do anything possible to not go at this issue head on, to not look at the bright light that is clearly shining in our faces. And it's so obvious that this is what needs to happen. I mean, and that is why the Iran deal, which you mentioned, which it's very heartening to hear that some of the same people are in the administration now in Iran. So look, some of the same neocons that advise Bush are in Biden's administration, but also some Obama people are in Biden's administration. You've got a mix here. And it's wild to me that, Biden, we talked about this for years before October 7th. Why isn't Biden getting back into the Iran deal? This would be so beneficial and important. And I don't know.
He promised that he would. Candidate Biden, we actually had a piece on foreign policy a couple of years ago. We basically said President Biden should listen to candidate Biden when it comes to Iran. He published a piece in CNN. He was going around criticizing Donald Trump. Most Democrats were for pulling out of the nuclear deal, not replacing it with anything better. And when they came to the White House, they didn't do that. They haven't done it yet. And, it's just spiraled into something bigger and more problematic since then.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.